Hello, I am Jayanto Chatterjee from IIT Kanpur, and we are interacting on services management contemporary issues. In the last session, you would recall, we were discussing about the famous, globally famous Indian service organization, Arvind Eye Hospital, and their associated organizations. And we examined how, by creating processes based on scientific principles, by creating workflow design in a way that jobs are partitioned in replicable modules, standards are set in such a way that a large number of people can be trained for a standardized process for optimal performance. We also examined that how, through proper time and motion study, through techniques like line balancing, through techniques like queue management, one can create a very humane but very efficient system, by virtue of which today Arvind Eye Care Foundation and their various units deliver world-class service at a cost that can be absorbed by people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. We also saw briefly their revenue management strategy, how paying customers who come to Arvind in spite of knowing that it is actually primarily a hospital meant for poor people, paying customers come there because the high quality of their service, and the payments that are received from such customers subsidize the service to the economically deprived people. A great service model. I am sure you have already seen on the internet, through Google, through YouTube, many presentations and several case studies that are available to you free of cost for reading, appreciating the nuances of this great service organization. And I would urge you again, if you have not already done, then please go beyond what we discussed in the last session and read very high quality resources, case studies, audio video presentations that are available to you on Arvind. Now, many of those cases, many of those reports talk about McDonald to Max Surgery, talks about the inspiration Dr. V received from high quality, low price delivery of McDonald's, and how Arvind Eye Care units replicated some of those principles into their service delivery. In today's session, I would like to discuss another important aspect for service excellence, which is not very well covered in those repositories of case studies and reports. Some of them do refer to this particular aspect, and that aspect is about human resource management and leadership at Arvind Eye Care. So, I am continuing to use that example as a live case study to highlight this other soft side, which often is much harder in creating service excellence, the people side. So, simply put, this strategy that Arvind follows for their human resources can be called the culture of empowerment. Simply put, they invest in their people, they recruit the right kind of people and invest continuously in their learning. We will go into the little bit detail of this, that what is the meaning of recruiting the right kind of people. But before that, I would like to clarify a few fundamental concepts. The diagram in front of you, this service organization excellence triad, is an evolved version of the triangle of service which I had discussed with you earlier. As you remember, at the three corners of this triangle, we have the service organization, the service customer, and the service personnel. Today, I would like to draw your attention that on every segment of this triangle, we have some kind of paradox. So, service organization expects from their employees, just as in Arvind we were discussing, repeatable standard service, efficiency. But interestingly, this kind of inspired efficiency can only be had if the people have autonomy. One feels from the assembly line concept that people will operate exactly within a defined boundary. They will act like automatons and they will act exactly tightening the same bolt again and again, or hammering the same point and again as jobs move over the assembly line. So, even though Arvind or such excellent service organizations adopt the process excellence by creating repeatable modules, they create the efficiency chain, but at the same time they give autonomy, decision making latitude to the people at the front line. So, this is one sort of dilemma, paradox, or dialectics that we observe. Similarly, between the service organization and the customer, we have this dialectics of efficiency versus satisfaction. The very important aspect that we will discuss a little bit more in the later session when we discuss about emotional labor. We discuss the particular challenges faced by service sector employees. This paradox, this dilemma, control versus co-creation, will be treated in depth there. But at this moment, we identify that there are certain tensions in this efficiency versus autonomy, or satisfaction versus productivity, customer satisfaction versus service productivity, and control versus co-creation. Now, one of the things you will notice here, that this contact personnel, they are normally simultaneously under two kinds of pressure. One set of pressure comes from the service organization. Service organization wants them to behave in a particular manner all the time, smiling, polite, accommodating, and so on. Whatever may be their internal mental condition, service organization wants them to behave in a sort of standard way. Researchers called it managed heart. The organization wants to manage the heart of the frontline employees. In the same way, the customer also wants good response, polite response, empathy, reliability. So, in some way, the contact personnel appears to be under sort of a dual pressure, and we will discuss this later on. But right now, I would like to draw your attention that this thing that we were discussing a little while back, the culture of empowerment. This culture of empowerment can be seen in this kind of control philosophy, or how the organization manages through a sort of self-management process. So you see here I have highlighted that whether it is in the belief system, whether it is in the diagnostic control system, the emphasis is on to contribute, to do right, to achieve, to create. So we are wanting the service employees in such organizations who achieve this kind of global excellence to be almost missionary-like. They should feel that they are doing something not just as a job, but they are doing something which goes beyond the call of normal duty. Missionary zeal. That sort of caring, learning, involvement with their jobs. Now, how do we achieve this? I'll just recall, this is not exactly, we don't have the time to go into the depth, but I would recall, and if you want, if you are not familiar with these concepts, I would request you that you can easily go to the net and study through Wikipedia and other open resources some of these concepts. That even though we had talked in the last session about McDonald's like, assembly line like process system at Arvind Eye Care, in the people management, however, in their approach to people, they don't believe in the theory X, which goes with Taylor, the father of modern mass manufacturing concepts. So such organizations don't believe like in theory X that people are, they don't really like to work. And so in general people lack creativity and initiative. Therefore you must provide them very defined job descriptions and not much room to maneuver. These organizations mostly, and if you study many of these service organizations, you will find that they combine the best of the so-called American system, the so-called very regimented, very controlled system, but at the same time they also practice theory Y, which is motivation based, creativity and initiative based processes. So some people have talked about theory Z, and so you might like to understand global excellence in service domain, to understand organizations like Arvind Eye Hospital, you may like to study a little bit about theory Y and theory Z, but this was just a tangent which I thought will be interesting. What is interesting is to understand the kind of people you want and how, what sort of leadership you provide. Again, this is another well-known concept. This is the concept of situational leadership. So as you know, in some of you who are familiar from organization studies or organizational behavior, again if you have not studied this, you can easily go to situational. There is in fact almost a very low price thin book also available on 1 minute leadership, I think is the name of the title of the book. So situational leadership means that the leader's behavior or the directive behavior and the employee behavior, if they are put into access, then we can develop different strokes for different folks, and we can recruit, train, develop, encourage, inspire the right kind of people. And what do you mean by right kind of people? What we mean is that we are looking for people who can be placed in this quadrant, S4. And S4, as you see here, is here. That means where the directive behavior is low and the supportive behavior is high, which means that we are looking for people who can work with little guidance, and they are mature and autonomous people. So in fact, in these sort of organizations, we will hardly recruit people at this level. That means people with low maturity and low commitment. We would like to take such people who believe in Arvind Eye Care, who believe in the mission of the organization, who feels that this organization is providing service which goes beyond the mere need of profitability. So many times such organizations display clear values, belief in principles like, say, the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. So this social concern, the social orientation, is quite clearly visible in most excellent service organizations of global standard. And to be able to do that, we have to recruit people who do not need much of guidance and who can be then developed into this delegatory frame. So we are looking at this domain, human to human interaction, and so employee selection, interpersonal skill development, and even in the technology, support that can engender trust is very important. In such organizations, even in the machine to human interface, there are design principles that should be followed. But we will remain into the people to people framework, and this is a very excellent model. This is called the satisfaction mirror, and this basically highlights that customer satisfaction cannot be derived if your employees are not satisfied. So more familiarity with customer needs and ways of meeting them, this is the employee attitude, the frontline attitude, will lead to more repeat purchases. If you give people more autonomy, greater opportunity to recover from service errors, that will be matched with encouragement to customer to complain, because the more the customer provides feedback, greater is the opportunity to recover from the error and create a deeper relationship with the customer. So higher employee satisfaction with this kind of autonomy, with this kind of system which encourages the customer to communicate, we can create this relationship, higher employee satisfaction leading to higher customer satisfaction. Of course, normally that will lead to higher productivity, lower cost, and improved quality of service, giving better result. This is a very famous research output model from Heskett. This is called the service profit chain. It highlights the same concept. The original article, again, you can just search service profit chain and you can find this paper. In fact, I think there is a book also based on the same principle. It again basically says that in the external market, satisfaction, loyalty, revenue, growth, profitability can only be derived if internally you have operating strategy and service delivery system that focuses on employee satisfaction, employee capability, and so on. So this balance or this continuity or this systems approach we are highlighting again and again throughout this course, and this is another way of representing that how this workplace design, job design, the decision making latitude, the autonomy provided to the frontline employees are so related to customer loyalty, customer retention, customer advocacy, and customer co-creation. Very deeply related. Now, two more concepts. This kind of organization where we are able to manage simultaneously autonomy and efficiency can only happen if you have well-trained, committed, highly inspired people. And this commitment, inspiration, this sense of mission, creation is the responsibility of the leadership. I don't have much time today because this session is focused on the issue of paying equal attention to human resource as you pay attention to the process design to create service leadership. But those of you who are interested, this is again in this session, as you see, I am again and again referring to certain fundamental concepts of organization behavior and organization design. So you may like to read up some of those if you have not already done so. So this concept is about level 5 leadership. And level 5 leadership is fundamentally that level 5 leaders are study in duality. They are modest as well as willful. They are humble as well as fearless. At first sight it appears to be contradictory. Just as contradictory as the paradox I was highlighting about efficiency and autonomy. But even at the leadership level, these globally excellent organizations display some interesting paradoxes or management of dialectics, that leaders in such organizations are modest, they have humility, but at the same time they have very strong will, humility as well as will. Focus on the superordinate goals as well as attention to details. The helicopter view as well as the microscopic attention to details. This duality is so well depicted in the life of Dr. G. Venkataswamy. I briefly discussed about him in the last session. His life, his biography is highly inspirational. Great reading to understand service leadership. Service oriented business philosophy that we have been talking about. And I highly urge that get hold of his writings, listen to him on YouTube and understand the nuances of this level 5 leadership. To conclude, I am going into a little bit an academic framework and I am leaving it with you, that for service excellence, the leadership must practice this people capability module. That means starting from a repeatable task performance at a high level of efficiency, one has to travel across this to the level of optimizing, achieved through continuous workforce coaching, So, coaching, learning, creation of the learning organization, all these concepts are highly relevant for creating this service excellence. So, from repeatable tasks, well defined, well managed to optimizing, this will be our trajectory, this will be our travel. So, I will conclude that to create the highly capable organization, service organization, for traveling on this people capability module, we need to create the cycle of capability where we have to carefully select employees, and I will discuss this a little bit more next week, that you have to also carefully select your customers. Just as Arvind Eye Care chose cataract affected poor people as their customers, and they chose people with missionary zeal to serve the people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So, this matching, focus on the right kind of customer, segmenting and targeting the right kind of customer, and creating the right kind of value proposition through your people, and continue to excel there by high quality training, well designed support systems to provide greater latitude to meet customer needs, autonomy at the front line, which however will not disturb the process flow, will not go against the scientific principles of work design and process flow design. Of course, this appropriate rewards and recognitions will be there, but today's session, if you revise, you will understand the focus has been on creating this missionary leadership and creation of this capability trajectory for people, the people capability model. So, please study these. It will be very important that you have clear ideas on these. Visit the Arvind website, read about level 5 leadership, read about the concept of situational leadership, so that we can handle the next session in greater depth. Thank you.